All right, welcome everyone to today's show. Today is January 7th of 2026, and today is a Wednesday. I have a few things to go over with everyone today. The first of which is this Minneapolis shooting from an ICE agent that is completely taken over the news cycle. We're going to go over that. We're going to go over how the video is very clear and concise that the ICE officer was in no way justified in using lethal force and shooting at this person 3 times. Mind you, so we're gonna do a little bit of a deep dive on that, see how the Trump administration has responded to this, along with all of right-wing Twitter and the right-wing media ecosystem. We're also going to tackle a little bit about the Department of Homeland Security's just absurd and insane tweets that are signaling more just overt white nationalism within the administration. Deeply disturbing stuff. We're also going to go into some news regarding the polling of how the American people are responding to the U.S. invasion of Venezuela, ousting Maduro. How much do I think this is going to impact Trump politically? What exactly are the political ramifications of this? Even from within his own base, we've often heard and seen the notion that a lot of right-wingers are supposedly non-interventionist isolationists now. We're going to see how much that actually holds up. And then lastly, I want to circle back to a story that appeared towards the end of last year, was that Israel had now banned 37 humanitarian, non-governmental international aid organizations. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on that just to cover our bases in terms of why I think that this is just a move that furthers their genocidal goals, which is really to ensure that the Gaza Strip is totally uninhabitable and that the institutions and infrastructure for life is fully unsustainable to facilitate a forced removal and ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. And that's pretty much going to cover it for today. But I hope today, goes well. As many of you may understand, that this is going to be my first daily show. We're going to do this as frequently as possible. So stay tuned. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps out big in the algorithm. And yeah, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Earlier this morning, we had videos circulating and news regarding this woman that was fatally shot in Minneapolis. So this woman was an American citizen. Apparently, U.S. citizens were obstructing ICE operations for obvious reasons. I think that Americans all across the country are tired of seeing ICE in their cities. Most people, I think, have a good understanding that ICE agents aren't indeed making the people of these cities any safer. And this is clear evidence of this right here. And this is not the first time, by the way, we're dealing with instances of ICE using just an absurd amount of force. We're seeing people getting, tossed and thrown to the ground. Oftentimes, in some cases, people getting hospitalized, including elderly individuals, and many of these cases being American U.S. citizens. And I think part of the reason why this is happening is ICE is undergoing large mass scale hiring and recruitment processes with very little to no training. And many of the people, joining ICE, especially in this day and age within the Trump administration, believe in this ideological mission and goal, something that the DHS has been signaling is often racialistic. So we're going to go over this video. This is sourced out of NBC News, so you're not going to see, even the original video doesn't show too much gruesome detail, but to the extent you're still going to see how, the gunshots and everything are blurred. But I just want to show you what exactly went on here and why it's so clearly indefensible, despite whatever, conservative commentator is going to be telling you. So just to provide brief commentary, the woman is going to be this woman in this vehicle. You see 2 ICE officers walking up to her. One of them heads towards the window. Neither of these officers are going to be the officers that ended up shooting her. She begins to back up with her steering wheel turned all the way to the left. So adjusting in a way in which she's clearly adjusting first to be able to drive away. And that's clearly what's going on here. What many of the conservative commentators, as well as Trump himself and Stephen Miller, are going to attempt to argue was that she was deliberately attempting to run the ICE officer in front of her over. So if you take a look here, you'll notice that there's an additional person right here. But she's clearly adjusting even before this person even walks up to her car. She's clearly adjusting as a means to drive off. And you can say, oh, she shouldn't have been driving off. She should, she's under detainment. Is she really? I don't know. I don't know if ICE was legally detaining her at this point. That's still yet to be seen. But let's go ahead and continue the video. And you're going to see when the first gunshot is fired and why it just makes no sense to argue that this is a legitimate use of lethal force. So notice now, she does begin to drive forward and the officer does begin to pull out his firearm. But then you'll notice immediately her wheels are turned. The ICE officer at this point has adjusted, meaning the wheels are turning away from the ICE officer that has shot her. And then there it is. The first shot happens. Take a look one more time. And we'll do it in full speed so you can get a feel for it. Boom. The ICE officer fires his first shot. Now, at this point, he's entirely out of the way of the car. And you're going to hear 2 more shots after this. Or at least 1 more. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Boom. So again, we're gonna roll it back to where the first shot is fired. Boom. Okay, so at this point, that's when the first shot is fired. You see each of this man's feet entirely out of the way of the vehicle. There is in no way justified reason to fire that first shot, but the conservatives online and the Trump administration themselves and this ICE department are not just going to have to defend the first shot. They have to defend all 3 fatal shots. Now, there's something else I want to bring up, which is that this is exactly why you need to be recording ICE in public spaces. You have a First Amendment right as a U.S. citizen, even if they're doing something in regards to detaining, arresting, or attempting to facilitate an arrest from someone who is undocumented. You have a right to record them in public spaces, and it's honestly incumbent on us as members of our communities for community protection to be engaging in these sorts of recordings. But the fact that this fatal shot happened is, like what I mentioned earlier, obviously a result of the mass hiring and underpreparedness and of ICE agents. They're ill-equipped to deal with these sorts of situations. They incite escalatory and lethal force behavior. Similar to the police department, but from what I've seen so far, ICE officers can be even worse, oftentimes because they're coming into communities that they're not even a part of. Now, the mayor of Minneapolis gave a passionate speech on this and told ICE to get the fuck out of Minneapolis. So this is Mayor Jacob Frey, at the immediate press conference. Listen to what he has to say.
There's a lot of information that is swirling around right now, and we collectively are going to do everything possible to get to the bottom of this, to get justice, and to make sure that there is an investigation that is conducted in full. But what we do know is that a 37-year-old woman is dead and that she was shot by ICE. We've dreaded this moment since the early stages of this ICE presence in Minneapolis. Not only is this a concern that we've had internally, we've been talking about it. They are not here to cause safety in this city. What they are doing is not to provide safety in America. What they are doing is causing chaos and distrust. They're ripping families apart. They're sowing chaos on our streets. And in this case, quite literally killing people. So they are already trying to spin this as an action of self-defense. Having seen the video of myself, I want to tell everybody directly, that is bullshit. This was an agent recklessly using power that resulted in somebody dying, getting killed. As soon as it happened and we learned of the incident, we had several priorities. The first, of course, was to get the victim to the hospital and to get care as soon as possible. To the family, I'm so deeply sorry. There's nothing that I can say right now that's going to make you or your relatives or the friends of the victim feel any better. There were, I believe, 2 Minneapolis police officers that responded and were in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The second was to get ICE off of the scene. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of ICE and federal officers that were there at the time. Having them there was only causing more chaos. Having them there was only making a difficult situation even more problematic, and one that, yes, they created themselves. There's little I can say, again, that'll make this situation better, but I do have a message for our community, for our city, and I have a message for ICE. To ICE, get the fuck out of Minneapolis. We do not want you here. Your stated reason for being in this city is to create some kind of safety, and you are doing exactly the opposite. People are being hurt. Families are being ripped apart. Long-term Minneapolis residents that have contributed so greatly to our city, to our culture, to our economy are being terrorized, and now somebody is dead. That's on you.
Just an amazing and passionate speech by the mayor here, and he's exactly right on a few fronts. The first of which is, what exactly is the use or purpose of ICE, right? It's not protecting communities. And a lot of people will rightly point out the fact that, undocumented migrants have a less of a degree of a propensity to commit violent crime. But even of those who are committing violent crime, or even of those who are committing drug-related crime or are here for nefarious reasons, all of those people can be dealt with other federal investigatory agencies. All of those people can be dealt with criminal prosecutory or investigative agencies like local police departments, the FBI, the DEA. ICE, this is why ICE abolition, and I think the advocacy of it ought to matter and is relevant of this time. And it's of, the left in the country to really push our elected officials and Democratic leadership in particular to adopt this as a genuine framework, because ICE is not protecting people. And we are seeing clearly with this administration that it's not only being weaponized in ways that are just abhorrently disgusting towards the community, like taking out the fact that deportations for people who have been here for years on end and have family here and are doing nothing but contributing, taking away just by the mere fact of that, by violently arresting and deporting people and doing that is just an abhorrent act in and of itself, considering it benefits nobody, and separating families is something that you would assume traditional conservatives would even oppose. But let's take that out for a second. ICE as an institution is being weaponized, in in some sort of racialized way, but also B, we're also seeing it weaponized on college campuses when it comes to silencing free speech. Earlier last year, rather towards the fall of last year, ICE, the Trump administration was found to have been using ICE in a way that what was violating the First Amendment of legal non-citizen students and faculty members on college campuses who were protesting for Palestine. A federal judge had ruled that year that the Trump administration was using ICE to arrest, detain, intimidate people for speaking out for Palestine. Right? So it's being weaponized not just against undocumented immigrants in a cruel and abhorrent way, but it's also being weaponized in a way that attacks legal non-citizens and intimidates them for speaking out for something that is, I guess, against the foreign policy interests of the United States, or it's being used against U.S. citizens who dare want to protect their community members. And in this case, you're seeing that very plainly, right? When you have these masked thug ideologues who are walking into these scenarios thinking that, you know, they're essentially the rule of law, even more so than local law enforcement, you have exactly this. And Minneapolis local law enforcement, even they have this happened earlier, or a few months ago, rather. A few months ago, there was this case in which ICE agents were dragging a potentially, supposedly pregnant woman. It's not really clear on that, on those merits, but a viral video came out of them dragging a woman through the ice-ridden streets of Minneapolis by the wrist, right? Handcuffed by the wrist, right? You like, it's very rare we even see that sort of law enforcement done by like police officers. Typically nowadays, especially because of the way that BLM has incentivized people to record police officer interactions, you're actually seeing less of those videos come out, at least from my estimation. Maybe I could be wrong. But Minneapolis local law enforcement in that case, even they were saying that ICE was using aggressive tactics, like forceful tactics. Even local police law enforcement were saying that. So, but it's good to see the mayor of Minneapolis coming at this in the right way. And what is disturbing, though, is how, but unsurprising, of course, is how both Donald Trump and this administration has characterized this egregious murder. So first of all, Stephen Miller, who is the head of our DHS and is essentially ran Trump's immigration policy, called the woman driving the car a domestic terrorist, which is laughably absurd, to say the least. But here's what Donald Trump posted on Truth Social. He said, "I have just viewed the clip of the event which took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It is a horrible thing to watch. The woman screaming was obviously, quote unquote, a professional agitator." To me, that hints as sort of like the sort of conspiratorial, left-wing organized obstruction, right? And a woman, and I'm quoting Trump again, and the woman driving the car was very disorderly, obstructing and resisting, who then violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer. So we just watched the video. The officer was not hit by the car. Now you can say he was at risk from being hit by the car because of the way that she was moving, because of how quickly the car ended up moving. But it was clear that the car was turned entirely to the right. She was backing up before that officer had even approached her car, signaling that she was adjusting to move away. And again, we can say, oh, well, she shouldn't have driven off. It was her resisting arrest. It was disorderly, et cetera, et cetera. Again, none of that is relevant as to whether or not it's actually justified for this officer to have used lethal force, and not once, not twice, but 3 different gunshots. Trump again says, based on the attached clip, it is hard to believe he is alive. Insane. But is now recovering in the hospital. I'm curious as to how he's exactly recovering in the hospital and what harms he underwent. The situation is being studied in its entirety. But the reason these incidents are happening is because the radical left is threatening, assaulting, and of course he makes it political, law enforcement officers and ICE agents on a daily basis. They are trying to do the job of keeping America safe. Again, I ask you, how is ICE keeping America safe when they're the ones who just killed an American citizen? They're the ones who have been caught doing egregious, overly aggressive uses of force against American citizens. And they're not doing the job of keeping America safe, right? Well over 70% of arrests and detainments of people by ICE are undocumented migrants with no criminal background. And of those who have a criminal background, very, very few have a violent criminal background. Again, the violent undocumented migrants and those who are using, or rather selling, or involved with illegal drug smuggling or what have you, those can be dealt with other federal agencies. ICE in no way does community protection. And then he says, we need to stand by, protect law enforcement officers. So what I just want to say about this is, I think it's going to be interesting because today this has been really the story of the day, but I think it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. Whether or not this ICE officer is going to be held accountable. I think that if the law is just in this case, and if this ICE officer is appropriately prosecuted, and if a judge rules in a just way, this officer should be in prison. But let's say the best happens. Let's say all of what I just mentioned happens. Who's to stop Donald Trump from pardoning this individual if that person is made out to be a martyr, right? We know Trump is totally comfortable pardoning violent criminals on January 6th. He was comfortable pardoning drug convicted criminals, such as the former president of Honduras. Right? Trump has no bounds with pardons. So I see that as a genuine possibility, and a disturbing one at that. But the last thing I want to say, and the last thing I wanted to bring up in regards to this, was according to Fox 9 Minnesota reports from Minneapolis, witnesses say a doctor was at the scene and tried to help the woman who had been shot, but ICE agents refused to let him through. Around 10 to 15 minutes later, and I'm no doctor, but I can say with a ton of confidence that if you have fatal wounds, every second as to whether or not you're being attended to matters in terms of the likelihood that you'll survive said fatal wound, right? So between 10 to 15 minutes later, an ambulance had arrived, but was blocked by ICE vehicles occupying the street. So there was no sense of urgency to get this woman help. The doctor who was at the scene was obstructed from doing so. And then even when ambulances arrived, between 10 to 15 minutes later, they were even obstructed to getting to this woman as quickly as possible. Again, there needs to be serious repercussions for this, but I find it disturbing how reflexive conservative media and conservative elected officials are at always defending the indefensible when it comes to really any sort of law enforcement abusing behavior, especially in regards to lethal force. So So we've talked a little bit about how ICE has been using obscene and abhorrent lethal force even against U.S. citizens. And we saw that today in the case of Minneapolis. But another case of what I've just noticed out of the DHS, and what I think a lot of us have noticed out of the DHS, is this DHS Twitter page has signaled some abhorrently weird, racialized, white nationalist dog whistles and tropes. And in this case, this is hardly a dog whistle. So the DHS tweeted, "The peace of a nation no longer besieged by the third world." And they tweeted this image, an AI generated image of apparently an artwork by Hiroshi Nagai, which may or may not be problematic to use AI artwork of an artist that obviously didn't give any sort of consent as to why this is. But the image reads, "America after 100 million deportations." And you'll notice the image is of palm trees, you know, a nice car by the beach, a beautiful wave, etc. So I don't know how much more explicit this can be as to how racialized those who are running our immigration system want our immigration policy to be. We know that Donald Trump has essentially entirely removed any sort of program for asylum seekers or refugees outside of white South Afrikaners. So white South Afrikaners are essentially the only ones that this administration cares to give asylum or refugee status to. All other even refugees who have been here for 10, 20 plus years under status, are not having their status renewed under the Trump administration, whether they're from Honduras, Venezuela, any of these nations that, you know, the Trump administration is clearly comfortable doing regime change in. But we know that the policy has been racialized, and so is the rhetoric. America after 100 million deportations, okay? It is estimated that the United States has between 12 to 15 million undocumented migrants. So they're not just referring to undocumented migrants here. And they can't be just referring to immigrants either, because it's around 30 million people who are legal immigrants within the United States. But even if we were to take like the most absurd and the most extreme conclusions, the conspiratorial conclusions about how many immigrants are in the United States and how many of them are undocumented, it does not come up to 100 million. 100 million, that's nearly a third of the US. That's at least like 25% of the US population. 100 million people. There is no way to deport 100 million people without deporting US citizens. And the fact that this is accompanied by the statement, "no longer besieged by the third world," we're living in a time where I'm just like Nazi fascistic dog whistles are so overt and prevalent within our Department of Homeland Security. And everyone's walking around as though it's normal. And there's a legitimate strategy to this, you know, the Steve Bannon strategy of flood the zone, flood the media news cycle to where it's so much the average person really cannot keep up with what the next absurd thing this administration is engaging in. But that's sort of my worry, is Trump has broken so many precedents, and we're finding out with this sort of rhetoric that many of those people probably within my generation who are running these accounts are a lot more far right than many people would like to believe, or that many of us are led on to believe. But we've broken so many precedents. what's to stop the next right-wing administration from being even worse, right? What's to stop the next administration from engaging in genuine Holocaust denial, Nazi dog whistles, or explicit attempts at racialized white supremacist ideology in an attempt to only facilitate immigration from European or white nations, right? Because to me, there's no other way of interpreting this outside of an explicit white nationalist dog whistle. The tweet is praising the idea of deporting 100 million people from this country. And the dog whistle of the third world can only be interpreted really as a in a firm front to what is considered non-white nations, right? So Venezuela has really been interesting for a number of reasons. I think if anyone who had been following the story regarding the boat strikes on Venezuelan boats since they began could tell you that this was always leading somewhere as to, interventionism, regime change, escalatory action. We had U.S. Navy warships, building up within the Caribbean. Venezuela is not a primary producer of drugs funneled to the United States. It doesn't even rank in the top 3 of Latin America countries. So Colombia, it's like over 60% of the cocaine coming into the United States is from Colombia. And then the other 2 nations, I believe, are Bolivia and Brazil or Nicaragua might be one of the other ones. But Venezuela does not rank within the top 3. And normally when Donald Trump would talk about why it's important that we stop drugs from coming into the United States, he'd talk about the tens of thousands of deaths that are occurring every single year due to things like fentanyl overdoses. But fentanyl, that's not even produced in Venezuela whatsoever. Like the main drug that's produced in Venezuela, to the extent that drugs are produced, is cocaine, not fentanyl. Fentanyl, for the most part, comes in actually through Mexico, is manufactured in China, and is brought in but via land by U.S. citizens. So every part about the initial U.S. strikes on Venezuela boats were complete bullshit as to whether or not this was truly about drugs. And so even posts like the Washington Post, the New York Times, any of these news agencies, even they were reporting on how experts were saying that this was clearly signaling or leading up to an eventual interventionist attack, a coup attempt. And then, of course, we saw what unfolded at the very beginning of this year in 2026. So, an interesting fact. So, to me, it's not that surprising what had occurred. What may be more surprising is the fallout, considering what the United States is planning to do. You've seen the administration flip a little bit back and forth as to whether or not they want to be able to run the country, whether or not they're going to install a government themselves, whether or not they're going to allow the current vice president of Venezuela, who is obviously assumed a leadership role, someone who's very pro-Maduro, by the way, whether they're going to allow him, to allow this person to be in power, but ensure that the oil at the very least is funneled to U.S. companies or what have you, right? I'm curious, depending on how bad the fallout is, because we didn't see any U.S. Service members or anything like that really harmed during this invasion, which saved face politically for Donald Trump. But it'll be interesting to see as to whether or not this is going to be politically damaging for the Trump administration. So this is out of the Washington Post, and they did a little bit of investigatory research as to how the general American public feels about our recent incursion into Venezuela. So here's from the Washington Post. More Americans say the United States should not run Venezuela. Now, Americans are split about the U.S. capturing Maduro, with many still forming opinions, according to a poll conducted by the Washington Post and SSRS using text messages over the weekend. About 4 in 10 approved of the U.S. military being sent to capture Maduro, while roughly the same were opposed. So in other words, Americans are pretty split down even as to whether or not it was good for us to get Maduro. About 2 in 10 were unsure, which is a pretty large portion of the population. 20% of people just aren't unsure of the situation. Republicans broadly approve of the action, while Democrats were largely opposed to it. So that's obviously going to be politically partisan. Now it says nearly half of Americans, 45%, were opposed to the United States taking control of Venezuela and choosing a new government for the country. About 9 in 10 Americans said that the Venezuelan people should be the ones to decide the future leadership of the country. I think everyone really should agree with that statement, right? The Venezuelan people deserve representation, as do all people around the world, for who governs them. But half saying that the United States should not take control. In December, a Quinnipiac poll found that 6 in 10 registered voters opposed U.S. military action in Venezuela. Republicans were more divided. About half were in support, while about 1/3 were opposed, and 15% didn't have an opinion. So this is the other thing I wanted to bring up, which is that the modern rendition of the Republican Party and sort of how this popular right movement has come into fray, one of the sort of assumed aspects of positions or knowledge that this new Republican Party has taken on is a non-interventionist or more isolationist approach to foreign policy. Or at least that's how it's framed, right? And this is even the case with media figures like Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk back in the day would have told you the neocons, and even leading up really to the 2024 election, would have told you the neocons, they're out, right? Trump 2.0 will not be beholden to foreign policy interests of neoconservatives. We're not going to be getting into endless wars. The No New Wars branding was one of the centerpieces of how Donald Trump framed his foreign policy, right? The peace ticket. And Trump was able to really capitalize on the Biden administration, both being to some degree pretty interventionist. Although the only thing I'll give Biden credit for is that he did silently kill a lot of the drone war. Now, of course, to what extent that's even mitigated by the fact that he gave endless U.S. and weapons shipments to Israel without red lines, despite continuously stating that he was pushing for red lines. But with that being said, the Donald Trump administration was able to capitalize on the fact that Joe Biden had October 7th, and then he also had the Russian invasion of Ukraine under his administration, both of which prompted, of course, major U.S. military support and weapon shipments to each of those countries. And Trump was able to frame himself as a non-interventionist peace ticket in which, both wars would have never happened under his administration. I think that's complete BS. I think in many aspects, October 7th actually happened because of U.S. posturing under Trump's first term, but that's really besides the point. So Trump was really able to capitalize off of this, and the Republican base isn't quite as non-interventionist as the new America First right would make you believe. And some of these polls kind of get into this. So again, here's the Washington Post. Few Republicans wanted the U.S. more involved in the world's problems. Only about 1 in 10 Republicans wanted the United States to take a, quote, more active role in solving the world's problems, according to an AP NORC poll from September. They were much less likely than Americans overall, or Democrats and independents, to say the United States should become more involved. Now, of course, they say this, but then maybe when you ask them on the merits, like, for example, should the United States continue sending weapon shipments to Israel, they'll overwhelmingly say yes. They're also more likely to say yes to Donald Trump's airstrikes on Iran earlier last year. So to what extent this is, authentic is a little dubious to me. But again, I think what's important to note is that anyone who followed Donald Trump's first term closely will tell you that the idea of him being a non-interventionist populist president was complete BS. Okay, Donald Trump accelerated the drone strikes and using the drone war by a multitude of several thousand% under his administration. Donald Trump engaged in a ton of posturing that led to Palestinian resistance groups being more incentivized to carry out violent resistance, which is exactly what happened in the case of October 7th, and exactly as to why we're in the position we're in now, where Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza. But there's really no reason to have believed that Donald Trump was a non-interventionist president. And now we've seen, within less than a year of him taking office, he has bombed a multitude of new countries, including Iran, Nigeria, and now Venezuela. And that was also clear by the time he had assumed office and appointed people like our Secretary of State Marco Rubio as our Secretary of State, right? Someone who is extraordinarily hawkish when it comes to foreign policy. So what a lot of this data tells me is that Americans, although they're pretty split as to whether or not they are comfortable with the fact that the United States invaded Venezuela and ousted Maduro. Maduro is extraordinarily unpopular, so that doesn't surprise me. What happens now is the fallout of that, right? If Donald Trump and this administration take an extraordinarily active role in still assuming control over the Venezuelan government, who now assumes power, the oil industry, and if that eventually blows up in its face, which it very likely could, considering, regime building and nation building doesn't exactly have a tidy or successful past in this country. When the United States engages in it, that could really affect him politically in the polls. Not that Donald Trump, or not that really Democrats need it coming into the midterms. Donald Trump is underwater on virtually every single issue, but I think now, but similar to the way that Biden was looking, where Biden was dealing with an economy that was really hurting for the average US citizen, considering inflation was so high, people saw Biden's priorities being increasingly directed towards things such as foreign policy. I see that now happening with the Donald Trump administration, where they're falling under that same mistake, and Trump really has no legislative priorities. And part of that is just because Republicans do not have a coherent economic agenda outside of tax cuts and deregulation, which it clearly is not working. And I guess tariffs are the other thing. And we're going to even see if tariffs hold up in the Supreme Court. But beyond that, I think it's going to be overall damaging to Donald Trump and his administration. So the last story I wanted to talk about today was Israel saying that they will now bar, and I believe it was 37 international aid groups from the Gaza Strip. Again, these are all aid groups that have previously worked within the Gaza Strip. And the excuse, or rather the reason that Israel is giving, is that these aid groups are not giving full details about the workers that are going into the Gaza Strip. And they're requiring these agencies to disclose all of the information regarding their workers. Now, you should ask yourself, right, this isn't just Doctors Without Borders. This isn't just the Oxfam. This isn't just the World Food Program. This isn't just any particular agency or aid group that is refusing to allow Israel to have oversight over their their employees' documentation and information, right? This is virtually every single international aid organization is refusing this. And so clearly there is a common incentive as to why these aid organizations feel as though it would not be necessary for the Israeli government to have full information about their employees. And part of that is because Israel is extremely dangerous in how it operates against aid workers. We've seen them deliberately target and kill aid workers, such as the World Central Food Kitchen workers that were driving that truck. I believe this was in early 2024. Several members of this aid organization were driving a truck. Reportedly, the IDF thought there was a Hamas member near the truck, and they engaged in a double tap airstrike. The Gaza Strip is the most dangerous place to operate as an international aid organization worker. And so it's completely unsurprising as to why these aid agencies would feel as though, providing information about their workers would endanger the lives of their workers. So now you have a situation in the Gaza Strip where not only are these NGOs not allowed from going in, despite the terms of the ceasefire deal, I say ceasefire in air quotes, that is currently underway, despite the terms of the ceasefire deal compelling or hoping to compel Israel to allow more humanitarian aid than what was allowed in prior to the ceasefire deal, Israel has routinely undercut the amount of aid that they're letting in. They have routinely not met up to what the ceasefire deal states as to what their obligations are of letting aid in. And what this really is a smaller or more minuscule version of what Israel's game plan has been for the Gaza Strip really since they left it in 2005. So after Israel unilaterally withdrew their settlements and their internal presence within the Gaza Strip, they maintained an outer presence. And part of maintaining that outer presence was both to create conditions in the Gaza Strip, and really this also applies to the West Bank as well, but more so of the Gaza Strip. But the blockade and the obstruction and prevention of things like raw materials from coming into the Gaza Strip destabilized their economy as a means to deliberately de-develop and underdevelop it. And what ended up happening is Gaza, again, similar to the West Bank, but more so, Gaza became increasingly dependent on international aid. And this is exactly what has happened thus far in the genocide, in part as to why I think the ICJ case, there's a compelling case to make is for Israel committing a genocide, is Israel has deliberately targeted the civilian infrastructure and the means for the Gaza population to sustain itself, right? And doing that upon also killing large numbers of people and deliberately targeting and killing civilians in mass is to incentivize an ethnic cleansing. This is something that everyone from Israeli war cabinet officials to Netanyahu to IDF spokespersons to Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the worst of the worst, have either hinted at or mentioned explicitly, depending on what part of Israeli society and what part of the Israeli government they operate. But and this is their way of doing this during the quote unquote ceasefire. We've seen over 400 people die since this ceasefire began. So the killing hasn't stopped, and the aid has been far below what it was supposed to be in order for in order for Israel to comply with the ceasefire that it supposedly had agreed to. But now they're preventing all new aid agencies from going in, and they've already instituted a complete ban on international journalists since the very beginning. So now you have no journalists are allowed into the Gaza Strip, but simultaneously you now have no more international aid organizations. And many of the testimonies as to the egregious war crimes, all these stories of doctors from agencies like Doctors Without Borders coming out to agencies after they had left the Gaza Strip and saying, we found sniper bullets in children's skulls. Those were the testimonies we were relying on to discover what was really happening inside the Gaza Strip, outside of course, Gazans themselves. But now you're stuck with a situation where both journalists and international aid organizations aren't allowed, and Israel is left free reign, where they're occupying internally majority of the Gaza Strip. And so everything that is going to come out of there is going to be done so based on Israeli discretion. So that is today's show. I appreciate all those for listening. Let me know down in the comments what you liked or didn't like about my analysis. I would love to hear your commentary regarding any of these stories. Again, be sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate any viewership or any of the support. So thank you so much. Until next time.